The air was a ghost. It had no scent, no temperature, no texture. It was a perfect, sterile void, cycled through a dozen filters until it was nothing more than a medium for oxygen, a carrier molecule for life that possessed no life of its own. He breathed it in, a slow, deliberate inhale that filled his lungs with the clean, cold emptiness of his world. The walls were the same, seamless, opalescent white. They curved into the floor and ceiling, leaving no corners for shadows to hide. There were no shadows here. The light was a constant, sourceless luminescence that bled from the very material of the room, erasing texture and depth, rendering everything flat and absolute. It was the color of forgetting. He sat on the edge of the cot, a slab of the same white material extruded from the wall, his feet resting on the cool, unforgiving floor. His name, he knew, was Specimen 734. It was a designation, not an identity, etched onto the back of his neck in precise, microscopic lettering he had only ever felt with his own fingertips. The name his mother had given him was a whisper in a dream, a phantom sound he could no longer quite grasp, like water running through his hands. He was an Omega. This, too, was a designation, a biological fact defined by the unique pheromonal signature that his body produced. It was a scent so rare, so potent, it had been classified as a strategic asset. His scent was the reason for the ghost air, for the filter systems that scrubbed it from his environment the moment it was exhaled. They captured it, distilled it, quantified it. They sold it. Or rather, they sold him, and the scent was the core of his value. He was not a person. He was a vessel. His world was this room, and the brief, terrifying excursions from it. The excursions were for viewings, for transactions. He would be led down a corridor of the same seamless white, the air growing thick with the smell of ozone, an antiseptic, a sign of proximity to the outside world, to other living things. He would be placed in a glass chamber, a human specimen in a jar, while figures in sharp, dark suits observed him. Their faces were always remote, their eyes calculating, like jewelers appraising a flawless, impossibly rare diamond. They did not see him. They saw profit margins, market dominance, a biological key to unlock untold influence. And then there was the hunter. He was always there, a silent monolith standing just beyond the periphery of the transaction, an alpha of such overwhelming presence that even the sterile air seemed to warp around him. He never spoke during the viewings. He simply stood, arms crossed over a chest encased in black tactical armor, his face obscured by the darkened visor of a helmet that seemed fused to his head. His scent was the only one the filters could not completely erase, a sharp, cold fragrance of ozone after a lightning strike, of ferrous metal, of something ancient and predatory. It was a terrifying scent, a promise of violence held in perfect, chilling stillness. The hunter was the one who finalized the transactions. After a buyer was chosen, after the untraceable transfer of immense wealth was confirmed, the hunter would be the one to escort the new owner and his prize. Ilara, he held onto the ghost of that name, Ilara, had been sold 3 times. Each time he had been led from his sterile room, placed in the glass chamber, and appraised. Each time a deal was struck, and each time the hunter had stepped forward, his movements economical and precise. He would place a heavy, gloved hand on the buyer's shoulder, a gesture that was not reassuring. Then he would turn his helmeted head, and through the opaque visor, Ilara felt the weight of his gaze. It was not like the buyer's gaze. It was not calculating. It was something else, something deep and unreadable, like staring into the abyss of space. He had never heard the hunter speak, not until the third time. The buyer was a corpulent man from the outer sectors, his face slick with sweat and avarice. The deal was finalized. The man licked his lips as he stared at Ilara, his thoughts a palpable stain in the clean air. The hunter stepped forward. His voice, when it came, was a low, resonant baritone, filtered through his helmet's vocoder into something metallic and inhuman. He did not look at the buyer. He looked at Ilara, straight through the reinforced glass. "You're worth a fortune," he said. The words hung him in the sterile air, devoid of inflection, a simple statement of fact. And then he had turned, placed his hand on the buyer's shoulder, and led him away, down a different corridor from the one Ilara would be taken down. Ilara was returned to his room. The door hissed shut, the filters hummed, the scent of ozone and iron faded. He was alone again in the white, silent world. He did not know what happened to the buyers. He only knew that after a few cycles, the process would begin again. A new viewing, a new appraisal, a new fortune exchanged. He was an asset, endlessly liquid, his value reset after each transaction. He did not wonder where the buyers went. He did not wonder why he was always returned. To wonder was to hope, and hope was a flaw in the system, an impurity to be scrubbed away like a stray scent molecule. He was specimen 734. He was worth a fortune. He breathed in the nothing air and waited for the next time he would be sold. The silence was his companion, the white light his only truth. He was not a person. He was not an asset. He was a waiting thing. And somewhere, in the corridors beyond his awareness, the hunter moved, a shadow in a world without shadows, his purpose as sterile and absolute as the room in which Ilara was kept. He was the final clause in every contract, the last unwritten term of sale. The summons came, as it always did, a subtle shift in the room's ambient pressure, a barely audible click as the magnetic lock on his door disengaged. It was a silent command, obedience coded into his very bones through years of conditioning. Ilara rose from the cot, his movements fluid and automatic. He walked to the center of the room and stood, hands clasped loosely behind his back, head slightly bowed, a posture of submission, a posture of display. The door slid open with a whisper of displaced air, revealing two orderlies in sterile white uniforms, their faces obscured by reflective face shields. They were furniture, animated parts of the facility's machinery. They flanked him without a word, their presence a cold pressure on either side, and guided him out into the corridor. The scent of ozone was stronger today, sharp and clean, a prelude to the transaction. It clung to the walls, a residue of the hunter's passage. Ilara's heart, a foolish, organic machine, began to beat a little faster. He kept his eyes fixed on the seamless floor as they walked, the white light of the corridor reflecting into a blinding glare. He passed his own reflection in the polished surfaces, a pale, slender figure with silver-white hair that fell into his eyes, his skin almost translucent. He looked like a photograph that had been left in the sun too long, all his color bleached away. He was led into the viewing chamber. The glass wall slid into place in front of him, sealing him in. On the other side, the room was darker, arranged like a severe, minimalist theater. In the center, under a focused beam of light, stood Dr. Aris Thorne, the architect of Ilara's existence. Thorne was a man carved from ice, his features sharp and precise, his pale eyes holding the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. He wore a lab coat so white it seemed to absorb the light around it. He was the one who had isolated Ilara's genetic markers, the one who had cultivated his unique pheromonal signature, the one who had designed this pristine prison. He was Ilara's creator, his god. Specimen 734, Thorne's voice was calm, clinical, echoing slightly in the chamber. Presenting at optimal hormonal levels, the filtration systems have captured a yield 3% above projections for this cycle. He spoke to the figures who stood in the carefully arranged shadows. Ilara could make out 3 of them. One was a woman in a severe corporate suit, her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. Another was an old man, his body augmented with gleaming cybernetics that whirred softly in the quiet. The third was a younger alpha, broad and arrogant, his expensive clothes failing to conceal the predatory set of his shoulders. They were the buyers, the vultures, and in the deepest shadow, near the exit, stood the hunter, a figure of absolute stillness. Ilara could feel his presence like a change in gravity, a silent hum at the edge of his senses. The scent of ozone and cold iron was a quiet anchor in the sterile room. Thorne gestured to a console. We will now introduce a controlled sample of the specimen's pheromones into the viewing room. A concentration of 0.001 parts per million. A soft hiss, and the air changed. Ilara could not smell it himself. He was immune to his own scent, another carefully engineered trait, but he could see its effect. The arrogant young alpha's nostrils flared, his posture tightening. The old man's cybernetic eye whirred, its lens dilating. The woman's composure cracked for a fraction of a second, a flicker of raw, possessive hunger in her eyes before she mastered it. They were hooked. The scent was a key, and it turned a lock deep inside their alpha biology, a primal desire for possession, for ownership of the unique and the powerful. Ilara felt a wave of cold nausea. He was a drug, and they were addicts getting their first taste. He was not a person. He was a chemical compound. The bidding began. Thorne facilitated it with the detached air of an auctioneer selling priceless art. The numbers climbed, spiraling into figures that had no meaning to Ilara. They were abstract symbols of his own worth, his own objectification. He kept his eyes down, focusing on a single, invisible point on the floor. He tried to make himself small, to disappear inside his own skin, to become nothing but the white room he came from. The arrogant young alpha won. His name was Kalen Vore, heir to the Vore Consortium, a dynasty built on interstellar shipping and resource exploitation. He smiled, a flash of white teeth in the gloom, a victor's smile. The asset will be a valuable addition to my collection, Vore said, his voice smooth and confident. Thorne gave a slight, satisfied nod. The transfer of funds has been confirmed. The asset is yours. He gestured toward the hunter. Our handler will escort you to the transfer bay and finalize the deliver. It was then that the hunter moved. He stepped out of the shadow, his movements unnervingly silent for a man his size. He walked not to Vore, but to the glass wall of Ilara's chamber. He stopped directly in front of him, so close that if the glass were not there, they would be breathing the same air. The dark visor of his helmet was a black mirror, reflecting Ilara's own pale, startled face. For a long moment, there was only silence. The hunter simply stood there, watching him. The pressure of that gaze was immense, a physical weight. It was not the predatory gaze of the alphas. It was not the clinical gaze of Thorn. It was something else entirely. It was a gaze of assessment, of recognition. Then he spoke. The vocoder flattened his voice into a metallic monotone, but the words were clear. They were the same words as before. He was looking at Ilara, only at Ilara. "You're worth a fortune." The statement hung in the air, a strange, resonant chord. It was not a compliment. It was not a valuation. It sounded almost like a lament or a curse. Then he turned. The spell was broken. He walked to Kalen Vor, who was looking at him with an expression of impatient ownership. The hunter placed his gloved hand on Vor's shoulder. The gesture was identical to the one he had used on the last buyer. A quiet finality. "This way," the hunter's filtered voice commanded. Vor, puffed up with his victory, allowed himself to be guided toward the exit. He cast one last possessive look back at Ilara, a look that promised a future of gilded cages and suffocating control. Then they were gone, disappearing down a dark corridor. The other bidders melted back into the shadows, their chance lost. Thorn watched them go, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He turned his attention back to Ilara. "Return the specimen to containment," he ordered the waiting orderlies. As they led him away, back down the white hall, Ilara's mind replayed the scene. The hunter's stillness, the unreadable gaze, the two flat, metallic words that held a universe of meaning he could not decipher. And for the first time, a question, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass, pierced the placid surface of his conditioning. Why did he say it to me? The thought was dangerous. It was a crack in the perfect, seamless wall of his world. And through that crack, a sliver of terrifying, impossible curiosity began to shine. The return to the White Room was a descent back into sensory oblivion. The door hissed shut, and the faint, lingering trace of the hunter's ozone scent was instantly devoured by the humming filters. Silence and sterility rushed in to fill the void, wrapping around Ilara like a shroud. He sat on his cot, the cool, smooth surface, a familiar anchor in the disquiet that churned within him. He replayed the hunter's words, the metallic resonance of his voice. "You're worth a fortune." It was a statement of his commodification, the very essence of his tragedy. Yet, the way it was delivered, aimed at him like a carefully thrown spear, suggested another layer of meaning. It was not said for the buyer's benefit. It was not part of the sale. It was a private, two-word conversation through 6 inches of reinforced glass. He was not supposed to think. Thinking was a malfunction. His purpose was to exist, to secrete, to be. But the question persisted, a persistent thrum beneath the placid surface of his mind. Why him? Why did the hunter, the silent, violent enforcer of these transactions, single him out for this strange, repeated declaration? He waited. Time in the White Room was measured in the subtle cycling of the nutrient paste dispenser and the scheduled sanitation mists. He went through the motions, consuming, sleeping, existing. But his mind was no longer placid. It was a still lake whose surface had been broken, the ripples spreading outward, distorting the perfect reflection of the white ceiling. Several cycles passed. He expected the summons for the next viewing, but it did not come. The routine was broken. This was new, an anomaly. One cycle, as he lay on the cot, a sound penetrated the perfect soundproofing of his room. It was faint, a deep, percussive tremor that vibrated through the floor. It lasted only a moment, followed by a series of sharper, more distant cracks, like bones snapping. Then silence, more profound than before. Ilara sat up, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sound was not permitted here. Sound was chaos. It was a contaminant. He pressed his ear to the cool wall, straining to hear anything more, but there was nothing. Only the familiar, ceaseless hum of the filters. Later, when the orderly came with his nutrient paste, there was a change. Usually, these figures were seamless extensions of the facility, their movements economical, their presence null. This one, however, hesitated at the door. His gloved hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he placed the tray in the dispensing slot. Through the reflective face shield, Ilara could not see his eyes, but he could feel the radiating waves of fear. It was a novel sensation, someone else's emotion bleeding into his sterile world. On impulse, driven by the crack in his own conditioning, Ilara spoke. His voice was soft, rusty from disuse. What was that sound? The orderly froze. It was a cardinal rule. The specimen does not initiate communication. For a long moment, the man stood rigid, a statue of terror. He was likely weighing the certainty of punishment for speaking against the visceral fear that currently held him in its grip. Fear won. He leaned closer to the dispensing slot, his voice a choked whisper, distorted by his mask. The Vor Consortium. They sent an inquiry team. He paused, glancing nervously down the empty white corridor. They found him, Kalen Vor, or what was left of him, in a cargo container at the edge of the sector, decommissioned, all security protocols scrubbed. The orderly's words were clipped, technical, but the horror bled through. Decommissioned, a euphemism for annihilation. The hunter. He's not just a handler, the orderly whispered, his voice cracking. He's a cleaner. He delivers the asset, collects the payment, and then he erases the transaction. Every time. The buyers, they never take possession. They just disappear. The truth landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. The previous buyers, the men who had looked at him with such avarice, they were all dead, killed by the silent, imposing figure who finalized their purchases. The hunter wasn't a seller. He was an executioner. And the phrase, "You're worth a fortune," was not a valuation. It was a death sentence. The fortune was the price of their lives. Ilara stumbled back from the door, his breath catching in his throat. The world, which had been a simple, brutal equation, suddenly fractured into 1,000 complex, terrifying pieces. The hunter was not part of the system. He was a cancer within it, a rogue element of violence performing a dark, repetitive ritual. He was killing them. He was killing them all. The orderly, having said too much, scurried away, his footsteps silent on the polished floor. Ilara was left alone with the monumental, world-shattering revelation. He looked at his hands, at his pale skin. This body, this scent, was the bait in a monstrous trap. He was the lure that drew the wealthiest, most powerful alphas to their doom. And the hunter was the one who sprung the trap. A memory surfaced, the hunter's helmeted gaze, the black visor reflecting his own face. It was not a gaze of assessment. It was a gaze of warning, of shared conspiracy. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a weapon. And the hunter was the one pulling the trigger. The thought was terrifying, but underneath the terror was something else, something new and potent. The nausea he felt during the viewings, the cold degradation. The hunter felt it too. His violence was not random, it was targeted. It was a form of judgment, a twisted, brutal form of protection, the tremors he had felt through the floor. That was the hunter, at work. He was not a monster who served the lab. He was a monster who preyed on its clients. And Ilara, the passive, priceless object, was at the very center of his bloody orbit. The White Room no longer felt like a prison. It felt like the calm eye of a hurricane, a pocket of stillness in the midst of a storm of calculated violence he was only just beginning to comprehend. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghosts of dead men. The facility's rhythm remained broken. The viewing stopped. Ilara was left in the white void of his room, but the void was no longer empty. It was populated by the chilling new architecture of his reality. He was the bait. The hunter was the trap. Dr. Thorne and the facility were the unwitting hosts of a parasite that was methodically devouring their clientele. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. Ilara found himself listening constantly, straining for another tremor, another sign of the hunter's secret war. He became attuned to the facility's subtle atmospherics, the minute shifts in air pressure, the ghost sense that the filters caught and erased. He was learning to read the silence. Then the summons came again. The pressure change, the click of the lock. But this time, it felt different. There was an edge to it, a sharper note of authority. The two orderlies appeared, their movements even more rigid and precise than usual. As they escorted him, the scent of ozone in the corridor was overwhelming, so thick it made his eyes water. It was fresh. The hunter was not just near, he was present, a storm front waiting just beyond the visible horizon. They did not take him to the viewing chamber. They took him to a different wing of the facility, one he had never seen. The corridors here were darker, the white walls replaced by brushed metal that absorbed the light, giving the space a somber, martial feel. They stopped before a heavy blast door. It slid open to reveal a room. That was the antithesis of his own. It was a Spartan living quarter, dominated by a weapons locker, a diagnostic console, and a simple cot. The air was saturated with that cold, sharp scent of ozone and iron. This was the hunter's den, and the hunter was there. He stood by the console, his back to the door. He was not wearing his helmet. For the first time, Ilara saw him as a man. His hair was black, cut brutally short. The back of his neck was a lattice work of old scars and the gleam of a subdermal data port. He was tall, his frame lean but corded with muscle visible even through the black undersuit he wore. He did not turn as Ilara was brought into the room. Dr. Thorne was there as well, standing off to the side, his expression a mask of detached scientific interest. "A new protocol, Specimen 734, Thorne said, his voice echoing slightly off the metal walls. The repeated loss of high-value clients has become statistically significant, an unacceptable deviation in the asset's profit cycle. He paused, his pale eyes flicking from Ilara to the hunter's rigid back. Our analysis suggests a single common denominator, our handler, Kyle. The name fell into the room like a stone. Kale. The hunter had a name. Kale did not react. He remained perfectly still, his attention fixed on the console's screen. The disappearances are clean, Thorne continued, a note of grudging admiration in his voice. No evidence, no witnesses, just a series of ghost transactions. An elegant, if inconvenient, problem. One might assume our handler has gone rogue, developing a personal agenda. He took a step closer to Ilara. However, his termination would be inefficient. His skill set is too valuable. Therefore, we are implementing a new variable to constrain his behavior. He gestured from Elara to Kale. You will be quartered together. The handler will become the warden. His continued service, and indeed his life, will be contingent upon your security. If the asset is harmed, the handler will be decommissioned. If the next buyer disappears, the asset will be decommissioned alongside him. It was a cage within a cage, a leash made of another man's life. Thorn was using Elara as a shield, a hostage to ensure his rogue weapon fell back in line. Elara's blood ran cold. He was being handed over to the very man who had been murdering his buyers, the man who was either his secret protector or the architect of an even more terrifying fate. Kale finally turned. His face was stark, all sharp angles and hard planes, as if carved from granite. His eyes were a startlingly pale grey, the colour of a winter sky, and they held a chilling emptiness that seemed to absorb all light. A thin white scar cut through his left eyebrow, a permanent flaw in his severe symmetry. He looked at Elara, and his expression was utterly blank. There was no recognition, no anger, no conspiracy. There was nothing. It was more terrifying than any overt threat. The specimen is your charge, Kale, Thorn said, his voice crisp. Keep it functional. Keep it secure. The next transaction will proceed in 10 cycles. Ensure there are no complications. With a final, lingering look that was both a warning and an expression of profound curiosity, Thorn turned and left. The blast door slid shut with a heavy, final thud, sealing them in. The orderlies were gone. It was just him and the hunter, Elara and Kale. The silence that descended was heavier than any Elara had ever known. It was thick with the scent of ozone, with unspoken violence, with the weight of Thorn's ultimatum. Elara stood frozen just inside the door, his conditioning screaming at him to assume the submissive posture, but a new, defiant instinct kept him upright. Kyle watched him, his pale grey eyes unblinking. He was a predator observing new prey in his territory. The moments stretched into an eternity. The only sound was the soft hum of the console and the frantic beat of Elara's own heart. Finally, Kale moved. He walked toward Elara, his steps silent. He did not stop until he was standing directly in front of him, close enough for Elara to feel the heat radiating from his body. He was a furnace of controlled power. Elara forced himself not to flinch, not to look away. He met that empty, winter sky gaze. Kyle raised a hand, the black glove stark against the pale air. Elara's entire body tensed, expecting a blow. Instead, Kale's fingers brushed with impossible slowness against the side of his neck, tracing the line of his jaw. The touch was electric, a jolt of sensation in a life defined by its absence. It was not violent, it was not possessive, it was diagnostic, a scientist touching a strange new element. Then Kale's thumb pressed lightly against the pulse point, just below Elara's ear, feeling the frantic, terrified rhythm of his blood. He held it there for a heartbeat. 2, 3. His expression remained a perfect, unreadable mask. Then he dropped his hand and stepped back. He turned away, dismissing Elara as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture, and walked back to the weapons locker. He began to methodically clean a pulse rifle, his movements economical and precise, his focus absolute. Elara was left standing in the middle of the room, his skin tingling where the glove had touched him, his breath shallow. The silence returned, but it had a new quality. It was the silence of a shared cage, the silence of two weapons aimed at each other's heads, their triggers tied to the same string. He was no longer just bait. He was now the hunter's keeper and his jailer. The days that followed were a study in tension. They existed in the Spartan metal room like two opposing magnetic poles, repelling and yet irrevocably bound by the forces containing them. Kale was a creature of profound silence and routine. He woke before the room's regulated dawn, a grey half-light that mimicked a morning he'd likely never seen. He would run through a brutal series of physical exercises, his movements so controlled and efficient they seemed more machine than man. He would then spend hours at the diagnostic console, interfacing with the facility's network through the port at the back of his neck, his face impassive as data streamed across the screen. He ate tasteless nutrient bars that were little better than Ilara's paste. He slept in short, 4-hour bursts, a soldier's habit, lying perfectly still on his cot without a single twitch or sound. He treated Ilara with a chillingly complete lack of acknowledgement. He did not speak to him, look at him, or interact with him in any way. To Kyle, Ilara was an environmental condition, a piece of the room's architecture he was forced to inhabit. For Ilara, it was a new kind of torment. The sterile solitude of his white room had been replaced by a suffocating proximity to a man who was both his potential savior and his executioner. Kale's scent was a constant presence, the sharp tang of ozone and iron a permanent part of the air Ilara breathed. It was no longer terrifying, it was simply a fact, like the metal walls or the grey light. It was the scent of his new reality. Ilara's conditioning, however, began to fray at the edges. His world was no longer a seamless whole. It had textures, variables. It had Kyle. He found himself watching the hunter, studying him with the same intensity Thorn had once studied him. He watched the way Kale's muscles coiled and released during his exercises, the absolute focus in his eyes as he disassembled and reassembled his weapons, the subtle tensing of his jaw when a certain data packet scrolled across his screen. He was learning the hunter's silences, just as he had learned the facilities. One cycle, a new element was introduced. An orderly, trembling, delivered a tray through the slot in the door. It was not the usual nutrient paste. It was real food, a piece of bread, a wedge of something that looked like cheese, and an apple. It was so alien, so vibrant with color and potential scent that Ilara stared at it as if it were an explosive device. He looked up at Kale, who was observing him from across the room, his pale eyes narrowed. It was the first time in days Kale had directly looked at him. Ilara didn't move. This had to be a test, a trick from Thorn. Kale walked over. He picked up the apple. Its red skin was a slash of brilliant color in the monochrome room. He held it for a moment, then placed it back on the tray. He looked at Ilara, his expression unreadable. Thorn's experiment, Kyle said. His voice, without the helmet's vocoder, was a low, rough baritone. It was the first time he had spoken to him in this room. He wants to see if nurturing stimuli increases pheromonal potency. If you are a more valuable asset when you believe you are being treated as more than an asset. The clinical cruelty of it was pure Thorn. To dangle a semblance of humanity in front of him, only to measure its effect on his market value. The irony was a bitter acid in Ilara's throat. He felt a surge of cold, unfamiliar anger. He pushed the tray away. "I don't require it," he said, his own voice sounding thin and brittle. Kale watched him, a flicker of something. Surprise? Respect? in his winter-grey eyes. He didn't press the issue. He simply took the tray and placed it in the disposal unit, and the apple, the bread, and the cheese vanished in a hum of energy. The next cycle, the tray appeared again. This time, Kale intercepted it before Elara could see. He analyzed it with a small handheld scanner, then disposed of it. A silent act of what? Defiance? Sabotage of Thorn's experiment? Protection? Elara didn't know. The ambiguity was maddening. He had to break the silence. He had to know. He waited until Kale was at the console, his back to him. Elara took a breath, the ozone-laced air feeling sharp in his lungs. "Why?" he asked. The single word hung in the air between them. Kyle didn't turn. The data continued to scroll across the screen. "Why did you kill them?" Elara pressed, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "The buyers." Silence. The only sound was the hum of the console and the faint thrum of the facility's life support. "They look at you," Kyle said finally, his voice low, his back still turned. "And they see a thing. A beautiful, rare thing to be owned, to be put in a case. They see the culmination of their own greed." He paused, and his fingers on the console's interface stilled. "They don't see the cost. They don't understand what it is they are buying." The words were flat, devoid of emotion, but they struck Elara with the force of a physical blow. He had articulated the precise nature of Elara's degradation, the feeling of being reduced to an object of appetite. "And you?" Elara whispered. "What do you see?" Kyle finally turned his head, looking at Elara over his shoulder. His pale eyes were like chips of ice, but deep within them, Elara saw a flicker of a shared, burning cold. "I see a mirror," Kyle said softly. He turned back to the console. The conversation terminated as abruptly as it had begun. A mirror. The word echoed in the metal room. Kale was not just a weapon created by a system. He was a product of it, just like Elara. Elara was bred for his scent, a passive lure. Kyle was bred for his violence, an active tool. Both of them were assets, stripped of their humanity, their worth quantified by their function. Kyle's murders were not just about protecting Elara. They were about destroying a reflection of his own objectification. In killing the buyers, he was killing the men who would own him, control him, use him, if he were in Elara's place. It was a rebellion born of profound, violent empathy. The room was no longer a cage holding a warden and a prisoner. It was a cage holding two reflections of the same broken system. And Thorn, in his arrogant clinical detachment, had locked them in together, hoping to study the reaction, never suspecting he was creating an alliance forged in shared trauma and silent understanding. The 10 cycles were almost up. The next transaction was looming. But this time, the equation had changed. It was no longer just Elara's freedom at stake. It was Kale's. And Elara realized with a terrifying clarity that he would not let Kale be decommissioned. He would not be the reason the Hunter's rebellion ended. He was not just a mirror. He was a weapon, too, and he was finally ready to be aimed. The dynamic in the room shifted after Kale's admission. The silence was still present, a vast, metallic ocean, but now it was layered with a fragile, unspoken understanding. They were mirrors, reflecting each other's captivity. Elara found a strange comfort in Kale's presence, in his rigid, predictable routines. The Hunter's quiet violence, once a source of terror, now felt like a shield. He was a wall of cold iron and ozone, standing between Elara and the world that wanted to consume him. Kyle, for his part, began to treat Elara as less of an object and more of a tactical consideration. His acknowledgement was subtle, communicated in micro-gestures. He would angle the console screen away when sensitive information was displayed. He started leaving a single, untainted nutrient bar on Ilara's cot, each cycle, a silent offering that was a stark contrast to Thorn's poisoned apples. It was a communication in the language they both understood. Survival. One cycle, as Kyle was cleaning his sidearm, a small, sleek pistol that looked like a piece of polished obsidian. Ilara found the courage to approach him. He stopped a few feet away, watching the hypnotic efficiency of Kyle's hands. "Thorn will not make the same mistake twice," Ilara said, his voice quiet but firm. "The next buyer will be different. The security will be absolute. He will expect you to act." Kyle didn't look up from his work. He slid the energy cell back into the pistol with a soft click. "I am aware of the tactical probabilities. He is using me as your leash," Ilara continued. "If you fail, or if you succeed in killing the next buyer, he will have me terminated. He wins either way. You are contained." "The logic is sound," Kyle stated, his voice flat. He placed the pistol on the table, its dark metal gleaming under the grey light. A profound frustration bloomed in Ilara's chest. It was the frustration of speaking to a machine, a man so encased in logic and control that emotion seemed unable to find purchase. "Is that all this is to you? A tactical problem? A set of probabilities?" Ilara's voice rose slightly, edged with a passion that surprised him. "He called you a mirror. Don't you want to break it?" Kyle finally lifted his head. His pale grey eyes met Ilara's, and for the first time, the emptiness in them was gone. It was replaced by a deep, glacial rage, so cold it was almost perfectly still. "Every day," Kyle said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Every day since they programmed the trigger responses into my cerebellum and called it a skill set. Every day since they told me my only value was my capacity for violence." He stood up, the sudden movement full of coiled energy. He was no longer a machine. He was a predator, barely restrained. "They made me a hunter, and then they were surprised when I started to hunt. They point me at their enemies, and I comply. But they don't get to decide who the enemy is. Not anymore." He took a step toward Ilara, closing the space between them. "The men who buy you, they are the same as the men who made me. They see life as a commodity, a thing to be acquired. They are the rot at the core of the system. I am not protecting you, Ilara." He used his name. The sound of it in Kale's rough voice was a shock, a key turning in a lock deep inside him. "I am cleansing the rot. You are simply the light that draws the insects." The confession was brutal, stripping away any romantic notion of a white knight. Kale's actions were born of a cold, systemic fury, not personal affection, and yet it was more intimate than any declaration of sentiment could ever be. He saw Ilara not as an object of pity, but as a catalyst for his own righteous war. A fellow soldier. "Then what is your plan?" Ilara asked, holding his ground, refusing to be intimidated by the storm of controlled violence emanating from the man before him. "Thorn has accounted for you. He has me. We are in a cage of his design." Kyle's gaze was intense, analytical. He was reassessing Ilara, seeing not the fragile specimen, but the defiant intelligence in his eyes. A cage can be broken, but not from the inside, not alone. He turned and walked to the room's single viewport, a narrow slit of reinforced plexiglass that looked out onto a sterile service corridor. He placed his hand on the cool surface. "Thorn believes he has created the perfect prison. He is arrogant, Arrogance is a vulnerability. It creates blind spots. He looked back at Elara. He believes you are passive, a lure. He has never considered you a variable in your own right. A plan began to form in the space between them, an unspoken strategy session. Kale was the weapon, the force of action. But Elara was the key. His scent, the very thing that made him a prisoner, could also be a tool. Thorn controlled its distribution, but he did not control its source. The next viewing, Elara said, the idea taking shape, sharp and clear. He will want to display me, to show the new buyer the prize is intact. He will, Kale affirmed. Security will be heightened. My movements will be restricted. They may even have me sedated or restrained until the transaction is complete. They will want to demonstrate control, Elara continued, his mind racing. Control over you and control over me. He looked at his own hands. They can filter the air. They can distill my scent. But they can't stop my body from producing it. A slow, dangerous smile touched Kale's lips. It was a chilling sight, a crack in his granite facade that revealed the furnace within. No, he said, they can't. In that moment, the alliance was sealed. It was no longer a shared captivity. It was a conspiracy. They were two parts of a single weapon, finally aiming at the same target. Thorn, in his hubris, had made a critical error. He had mistaken a mirror for a simple reflection, failing to realize that two mirrors, placed face to face, create an infinity of possibilities. The cage was about to break, and they would be the ones to shatter it. The day of the final transaction arrived with a palpable sense of doom. A formal announcement slid across Kale's console. Asset 734. Presentation and transfer. Cycle 2820. Buyer. Representative Silas Ma, on behalf of the Cygnus Syndicate. Kyle's face remained impassive, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. The Cygnus Syndicate. They weren't just another corporation. They were the shadow power behind dozens of ventures like Thorn's facility, a vast criminal conglomerate that dealt in black market technology, illegal genetics, and human trafficking. They were the source of the rot. Thorn wasn't just selling Elara to a client. He was selling him back to the source, a tribute to his dark benefactors. This was the end game. Silas Ma, Kyle said, his voice a low murmur. He's not a businessman. He's one of the syndicate's founders, an ideologue. He believes in genetic purity and the right of the strong to own the weak. To him, you are the ultimate symbol of that ideology. He looked at Elara, his grey eyes holding a new gravity. They won't just put you in a cage. They'll deconstruct you, study you, replicate you. They will turn your uniqueness into a mass-produced tool of control. The words painted a future far worse than any Elara had imagined. Not a gilded cage, but a sterile assembly line where he would be the template for 1,000 other silent, broken things. It solidified his resolve into something hard and sharp as diamond. He would not be a template. He would be an ending. An hour before the presentation, the blast door to their room hissed open. It was not orderlies who entered, but a team of elite security personnel in heavy black armor, their helmets identical to the one Kyle used to wear. They carried synaptic dampeners, short batons that crackled with blue energy. At their head was Dr. Thorn. "Kyle," Thorn said, his voice calm and authoritative. "For the duration of the transfer, you will be placed in monitored stasis, a necessary precaution given your recent performance metrics." He gestured, and 2 guards moved toward Kale, their dampeners held ready. Kale didn't resist. He simply stood, offering his hands. They cuffed him with heavy magnetic restraints and led him to a recessed alcove in the wall that Ilara had never seen open before. It was a stasis pod, a vertical sarcophagus of clear plexiglass and steel. As they forced him inside, Kyle's eyes found Ilara's. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It begins. The pod door sealed, and a pale green gas filled the small space. Kyle's body went limp, his head lolling to the side. He was neutralized. Thorn turned his attention to Ilara, a triumphant, clinical smile touching his lips. You see, specimen 734? Order is always restored. Chaos is merely a temporary variable. Now come, you have a final performance to give. He did not need to use force. Ilara followed, his mind a vortex of cold calm. He was the only active piece on the board now. They led him to the viewing chamber. It was different this time. Brighter. The far wall was a massive screen showing a live feed of a pristine white transfer bay where a sleek black shuttle waited. In the center of the viewing room stood a single man. He was older, with silver hair and a face that seemed both kind and utterly ruthless. He wore a simple, elegant black tunic. This was Silas Ma. His eyes, a piercing blue, lit up with a scholar's delight as Ilara was brought in. Magnificent, Ma breathed, his voice a cultured baritone. Even more perfect than the data suggested. A true work of art, Doctor. He is the culmination of a lifetime of research, Thorn said, basking in the praise. The pheromonal signature is stable, potent, and entirely unique. He is the key to a new generation of influence. Ma walked slowly around the glass chamber Ilara was placed in, his eyes never leaving him. It was the familiar gaze of a collector, but with an added layer of intellectual hunger. He saw not just a prize, but a puzzle he was eager to solve. The hunter, Ma said, turning to Thorn. Your handler. I was told he was volatile. He has been managed, Thorn said, with a dismissive wave toward a smaller screen that showed Kale, unconscious in the stasis pod. An overtuned weapon, nothing more. He is no longer a factor. This was the moment, the blind spot, Thorn's arrogance. Ilara closed his eyes. He reached inward, past the years of conditioning, past the fear, past the identity of specimen 734. He reached for the core of himself, the biological furnace that the lab had so carefully cultivated. For his entire life, his body had been trained to suppress, to regulate, to release his scent only in controlled, minute doses. It was a reflex as deep as breathing. Now, he did the opposite. He pushed. He imagined every cell in his body opening, releasing, flooding his system with the essence of his being. It was not a thought. It was a physical act of will, a silent, primal scream. He opened his pores and let the storm out. The effect was instantaneous. A wave of invisible energy rolled off him, so potent it was almost visible, a heat shimmer in the air. The room's delicate sensors, calibrated for parts per million, were overwhelmed. Alarms began to shriek, red lights flashing across the consoles. Thorn's face went from triumph to shock. What is this? Uncontrolled release. It's impossible. But it was Silas Ma's reaction that was most dramatic. The cultured facade shattered. His blue eyes widened, the pupils dilating to black pits. His breath hitched, and a low, guttural growl escaped his throat. The raw, undiluted pheromone hit his alpha biology, not as a subtle influence, but as a synaptic tidal wave, bypassing all reason and control. He was no longer a scholar or a syndicate leader. He was a beast, driven by a singular, overwhelming imperative. Possess. Mine, he snarled, his voice a ragged thing. He lunged, not at Ilara's chamber, but at the control console, shoving Thorn aside. He slammed his fist against the panel, trying to override the lockdown protocols. The room plunged into chaos. Alarms blared. The guards, also alphas, were staggering, their discipline cracking under the pheromonal assault. They were trained, but not for this, not for a biological nuke. "Contain him," Thorn shrieked, trying to regain control, but Ma was a man possessed. And in that chaos, the second part of the plan unfolded. Kale's stasis pod, its systems shorted out by the pheromonal overload that had fried the adjacent consoles, hissed open. The green gas cleared. Kale was awake. He had never been in stasis. The gas was a decoy, the limpness an act. He had been waiting, listening, his senses on a razor's edge. He burst from the pod, a blur of black motion. The magnetic cuffs on his wrists fell away, unlocked by a hidden override. The guards, disoriented and struggling against their own instincts, were no match for him. Kale moved through them like a surgeon, his strikes precise and disabling. A blow to a nerve cluster here, a dislocated joint there. He was not killing them. They were pawns. His targets were the kings. He seized a pulse rifle from a fallen guard and leveled it, not at Ma, but at Thorn. The scientist froze, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. "You," was all he could manage. Kyle fired. The shot was not a kill shot. It was a perfect, precise blast that vaporized the master control panel on the wall behind Thorn, showering him with sparks. All systems went critical. Doors unlocked. Containment fields failed. The facility's carefully maintained order dissolved into screeching, flashing anarchy. Kyle grabbed Ilara's arm, his grip like iron. "Now," he said, his voice calm in the center of the storm. He shattered the glass of Ilara's chamber with the butt of the rifle and pulled him out. Ilara stumbled, his senses reeling from his own pheromonal output and the cacophony around them. Ma, seeing his prize being taken, let out a roar of pure fury and charged at them. Kale didn't hesitate. He raised the rifle and fired a single clean shot through Ma's chest. The syndicate leader fell, his eyes wide with shocked comprehension in the last second of his life. He had been so focused on owning the art, he never saw the artist's signature. Kale didn't spare him a second glance. He pulled Ilara toward the corridor. "Move!" They ran. They ran through the screaming chaos of a facility tearing itself apart. They ran past panicked orderlies and confused guards. They were a single entity of purpose in a world of disorder. The sterile white corridors were stained with red emergency lighting. The ghost air was thick with the smell of ozone, burnt wiring, and Ilara's own triumphant, terrifying scent. He was not an asset. He was not a specimen. He was free. And as he ran, his hand held tight in Kale's, he felt the cool, exhilarating rush of the unknown world ahead. The cage was broken. The transition from the sterile, ordered chaos of the facility to the raw anarchy of the outside world was a violent sensory assault. Kyle dragged Ilara through a series of service tunnels, the air growing thick and humid, tasting of rust and damp concrete. The pristine white walls gave way to stained metal and exposed conduits. The sourceless light was replaced by the intermittent flash of emergency strobes. Then Kale kicked open a heavy maintenance hatch and the world exploded. Rain. It was the first thing Ilara registered. Cold, stinging drops that struck his face, his hands, his thin uniform. He had only ever known recycled, purified water. This was wild, chaotic, smelling of dust and ozone and something green and alive. He gasped, stumbling to a halt. They were in a narrow alleyway wedged between two towering, monolithic buildings that scraped a sky the color of a bruised plum. The air was a thick soup of 1,000 smells: exhaust fumes, frying food, damp refuse, the wet wool scent of a crowd of people. Neon signs in languages he didn't recognize bled lurid pinks and electric blues onto the wet pavement, turning the falling rain into a cascade of liquid light. Sound was everywhere. The hiss of tires on wet streets, the distant wail of a siren, the murmur of 100 conversations, the pounding bass of music from a nearby club. It was a deafening, overwhelming symphony. For a boy raised in absolute silence, it was like being plunged into a sea of noise. Elara froze, his senses overloaded to the point of shutdown. The world was too big, too loud, too much. He felt a wave of vertigo, his legs threatening to buckle. He was a creature of the lab, a sterile specimen. He was not made for this. Kale's grip on his arm tightened, a solid, grounding pressure in the swirling chaos. "Breathe, Elara." Kale's voice was low and steady, a rock in the flood. "Focus on me, my scent. Anchor to it." Elara squeezed his eyes shut, trying to obey. He filtered out the cacophony, the riot of smells, the overwhelming visual noise, focused on the single familiar point in his new universe: Kale. He breathed in, and beneath the city's olfactory scream, he found it. The clean, sharp scent of ozone and iron, the scent of his cage, which was now the scent of his freedom. It was the only familiar thing in this terrifying new world, and he clung to it like a drowning man. The panic receded, leaving him trembling but upright. He opened his eyes. Kyle was watching him, his face unreadable in the shifting neon glow, the rain plastering his short black hair to his scalp. He looked like a fallen god, stark and severe, against the city's garish backdrop. "We have to move," Kyle said. "Thorn will have triggered every syndicate alert in the sector. They'll be hunting us with everything they have." He began to pull Elara through the labyrinthine alleyways, moving with a predator's purpose. He stayed to the shadows, his eyes constantly scanning rooftops, doorways, reflections in puddles. He was in his element here. The city was just a different kind of jungle. Elara struggled to keep up, his soft-soled lab shoes slipping on the slick pavement. The thin uniform he wore was soaked through in seconds, clinging to his skin, offering no protection from the cold. He had never felt cold like this, a deep, invasive chill that seemed to settle in his bones. He was acutely aware of his own vulnerability, a fragile thing in a world of concrete and steel. After what felt like an eternity of running, Kale ducked into a darkened doorway and keyed a sequence into a grimy, archaic-looking keypad. A heavy metal door groaned open, revealing a flight of rickety stairs ascending into darkness. They climbed, the only sound the drip of water and their own ragged breaths. The air grew stale, thick with the smell of dust and decay. They emerged into a small, derelict apartment. It was a single room, furnished with a stained mattress on the floor, a broken table, and a cracked window that looked out over a panorama of glowing towers and rain-swept streets. A single bare bulb cast a weak, yellow light, illuminating dancing dust motes. It was filthy. It was broken. It was the most beautiful place Elara had ever seen. Kale immediately went to the window, peering through the grimy glass. "This is a dead zone," he explained, his voice low. Old building, pre-network infrastructure. Hard to scan, easy to defend. It will buy us a few hours. Ilara stood in the center of the room, dripping onto the dusty floorboards. He was shaking, not just from the cold, but from the adrenaline crash, from the sheer world-breaking scale of what had just happened. He looked at Kale's back, at the tense set of his shoulders as he kept watch. He had seen this man kill. He had seen him defy their creators. He had followed him into a world that was actively trying to overwhelm him. He took a hesitant step forward. Kale. The hunter turned. The hard lines of his face were softened slightly by the dim, yellow light. Rainwater dripped from his jaw. For the first time, he looked less like a weapon and more like a man. "You're hurt," Kyle stated, his eyes fixed on Ilara's hand. Ilara looked down. He hadn't even noticed. A long, shallow cut snaked across his palm, a gift from the shattered glass of his chamber. Blood, shockingly red, welled from the wound, tracing a path down his wrist. It was the first time he had seen his own blood in years. Kale crossed the room in 2 strides. He took Ilara's hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. The contrast between the rough texture of his glove and the fragile skin of Ilara's palm was a universe of sensation. Kyle produced a small medpack from a pouch on his belt. With practiced efficiency, he cleaned the wound with an antiseptic wipe. The sting was another new, sharp sensation, and applied a thin, translucent biosealant. Throughout the entire process, he held Ilara's hand with a steady, unwavering firmness. The simple, clinical act felt profoundly intimate. In the sterile world of the lab, touch had been a violation, a procedure. Here, in this dusty, forgotten room, it was an act of care. When he was finished, Kale didn't immediately let go. His thumb brushed over Ilara's knuckles, a slow, deliberate movement. Ilara's breath hitched. He looked up, and his gaze met Kale's. The winter-grey eyes were no longer empty. They were filled with a complex storm of emotions Ilara couldn't begin to name. Gratitude, exhaustion, and a deep, resonant grief settled in Ilara's chest. The enormity of Kale's actions, the years of silent, bloody rebellion he had waged, finally crashed down on him. "You killed them," Ilara whispered, the words barely audible over the sound of the rain against the window. "All of them. For me." Kyle's expression didn't change, but his grip on Ilara's hand tightened almost imperceptibly. He didn't offer a denial or an explanation. He just gave a single, slow nod. It was all the confirmation Ilara needed. In that moment, in the quiet of the dusty room, surrounded by the roaring city, the last wall of Ilara's conditioning crumbled into dust. He was not a specimen, he was not an asset. He was Ilara, and he was not alone. The hours that followed were suspended in a strange, quiet bubble. The storm of their escape gave way to a profound stillness, punctuated only by the relentless drumming of rain on the roof and the distant, mournful cry of city sirens. The single bare bulb in the derelict apartment cast long, dancing shadows, turning the small space into an intimate, self-contained world. Kyle had not let go of his hand. They stood there for a long time, the hunter and his rescued prize, 2 figures silhouetted against the grime-streaked window, while the city breathed and seethed below. The physical contact was an anchor for Ilara, a point of solid reality in the disorienting flood of his newfound freedom. Kyle's glove was coarse, the material designed for grip and protection, but the hand within it was warm, a steady, living heat that seeped into Ilara's cold skin. Finally, Kyle released him, the absence of his touch leaving Ilara's hand feeling strangely empty and cold. Kyle moved to a rusted locker in the corner of the room and pulled out a dark, heavy blanket and a set of dry clothes, a simple grey tunic and black trousers. They were old and worn, but clean. "Change," Kyle said, his voice a low command. "Your uniform has a subdermal tracker woven into the fabric. They'll be scanning for it." He turned his back, affording Ilara a semblance of privacy as he stripped off the cold, damp white uniform that had been his skin for as long as he could remember. Peeling it off felt like shedding a past life. The new clothes were rough against his skin, unfamiliar but solid. The blanket was heavy and smelled of dust and disuse, but when he wrapped it around his shoulders, it was blissfully warm. Kyle had stripped off his own soaked outer gear, leaving him in the thin, black undersuit that clung to his lean, powerful frame. Scars, pale and silvery, crisscrossed his arms and torso, a roadmap of a violent life. He was a tapestry of healed wounds. He sat at the broken table, methodically field-stripping the pulse rifle, his movements a familiar, reassuring rhythm in the quiet room. Ilara, wrapped in the blanket, sat on the edge of the stained mattress, watching him. The questions that had been circling in his mind for cycles finally began to surface, no longer held back by fear or conditioning. "How long?" Ilara asked, his voice soft. Kyle paused, his hands stilling over a component of the rifle. He didn't ask for clarification. He knew what Ilara meant. 3 years, he replied, his voice flat. 37 transactions, 37 buyers. The number was staggering. For 3 years, Kyle had been playing this deadly, solitary game. 37 times he had stood in the shadows and watched Ilara be sold. 37 times he had pronounced his strange, coded sentence. 37 times he had led a man to his death. The sheer weight of it, the sustained, cold fury required for such a campaign, was almost incomprehensible. "Why?" Ilara asked, the word full of a new, more personal meaning now. It was no longer about the mechanics of the plan. It was about the genesis of it. "Why start?" Kale set the rifle component down with meticulous care. He leaned back, the chair groaning in protest, and finally looked at Ilara, his gaze direct and unwavering. "Before I was a handler for Thorn, I was a field operative for the Syndicate, a cleaner. They bred me in a creche on Cygnus X1, enhanced my reflexes, my strength, my killer instinct. They pointed me at their problems, and I made the problems disappear." His voice was a monotone, a recitation of a life story that felt like someone else's. I was their most effective tool, and like any tool, they believed they owned me. One day, they gave me a new assignment: to acquire a rogue geneticist who had created an asset they wanted. The asset was a child, an Omega boy with a unique scent. The geneticist was trying to sell him on the open market. My job was to eliminate the scientist and recover the asset. Ilara's blood ran cold. He knew this story. Kyle continued, his voice dropping even lower. "I found them. The boy was no older than 10. He was terrified. He looked at me with the same eyes a cornered animal has right before the killing blow. I saw the data slate, the projections of his value, the plans for his vivisection, and in that moment, the programming broke. The tool decided it had a will of its own." He fell silent, his gaze distant, lost in the memory. "I eliminated the scientist, as ordered, but I reported the asset as lost, terminated in the crossfire. I took the boy and I disappeared. I found him a place, a quiet outer rim colony where no one would look for a ghost. I left him there. You saved him, Elara whispered, his heart aching. I delayed his fate, Kale corrected, his voice hard as iron. The syndicate never stops looking for what it considers its property. I knew I couldn't protect him forever by running. The only way to protect him, to protect any others like him, was to burn the whole system down from the inside. I needed to get close to the heart of the rot. So I let them find me. I played the part of the broken tool, repentant, ready to be of service again. They didn't trust me, but they valued my skills. They assigned me to the one place they thought I couldn't cause any trouble. A low-priority research facility run by an arrogant scientist named Thorn, overseeing a single, priceless asset. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Kale's entire existence at the facility had been a long con, a deep-cover operation of his own design. His assignment to Elara hadn't been a punishment. It had been an opportunity. And when you saw me, Elara began. I saw him again, Kyle finished, his voice rough with an emotion he quickly suppressed. The same cage, the same fate. I saw the pattern, repeating itself endlessly, and I decided, right there, that the pattern had to break. I would let them sell you, over and over. I would let them think their system was working, and I would use their own greed to bleed them dry, one buyer at a time. I would make you the most expensive asset in the galaxy, your price paid in the blood of the men who sought to own you. He looked at Elara, and the chasm of his pale eyes held a universe of pain, rage, and fierce, terrible devotion. You're worth a fortune, Elara, not because of your scent, but because of what you represent. The one thing they can't quantify or control, the part of life that refuses to be a commodity. The confession hung in the air, raw and absolute. Kale had not just been killing for revenge or rebellion. He had been waging a holy war, and Elara had been his unwilling, unknowing icon. The weight of those 37 lives settled between them, a grim testament to the depth of Kale's conviction. Elara looked at this man, this killer, this savior, this broken mirror of himself. He saw the years of solitude, the cold control it must have taken to maintain the facade, the weight of the violence he carried. He felt not fear, but a profound, aching empathy. He pushed the blanket aside, stood up, and crossed the small room. He stopped in front of Kale, close enough to feel the warmth of his body, to smell the faint, clean scent of ozone that clung to his skin. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently touched the scar that cut through Kyle's eyebrow. The skin was smooth, the old wound long since healed. Kyle went utterly still, his breath catching. It was a gesture of profound intimacy, an acknowledgement of the damage they both carried. "You are not a tool," Elara whispered, his fingers tracing the line of the scar. "You are not a weapon." Kyle closed his eyes, a flicker of something like agony and relief passing over his stark features. For the first time since Elara had met him, the hunter looked vulnerable. The carefully constructed walls of his control trembled, shaken by a simple, gentle touch. The city roared outside. The hunt was on, and their future was a terrifying unknown. But in that dusty room, two broken pieces of a brutal system found a moment of quiet, perfect, and devastating grace. They were not just mirrors. They were a reckoning. The dawn broke grey and weeping, the rain finally easing to a miserable drizzle. The neon glow of the city faded, replaced by a flat, unforgiving light that revealed the grime and decay of their temporary sanctuary in stark detail. Sleep had been a fleeting, shallow thing. Ilara had rested on the mattress, wrapped in the heavy blanket, while Kyle had remained at the window, a sleepless sentinel, watching the city's arteries for any sign of the syndicate's hunters. The quiet intimacy of the night had receded with the darkness, leaving a tense, pragmatic silence in its wake. Their survival was a problem with 1,000 variables, and Cale's mind was already calculating the odds. Ilara watched him, this man who had carried a secret war on his shoulders for years. The confession had changed everything. Kyle was no longer an enigma. He was a man defined by a singular, radical act of compassion that had spiraled into a campaign of righteous slaughter. Ilara's own identity had been reforged in the chaos of their escape. He was no longer specimen 734, the passive object. He was a catalyst, a variable Thorn had fatally underestimated. He felt a new sense of agency, fragile but fierce. He was a participant in his own life now. "They will be looking for 2 people," Ilara said, his voice cutting through the morning quiet. Kyle turned from the window, his face etched with fatigue, but his eyes were sharp, alert. "They will have my biometrics, my genetic profile from the creche. They will have your pheromonal signature. In a city this wired, we are ghosts with footprints. They will find us." "Then we need to change the footprints," Ilara said, the idea taking form as he spoke. He stood up, the blanket falling from his shoulders. He felt the chill of the room, but it no longer felt invasive. It was just a sensation, a piece of the real world. You were a cleaner for them. You know their methods, their protocols. How do you erase a ghost? Kyle's gaze sharpened with a hunter's focus. He was seeing Ilara not as someone to be protected, but as a strategic partner. "Identity is data," Kale said, his voice returning to its clinical, analytical tone. "To erase a ghost, you corrupt the data, or you create a new ghost so loud the old one becomes whispers." He walked to the broken table and tapped on a data pad he had taken from one of the guards. It was a standard syndicate issue, heavily encrypted, but Kale's fingers moved over the interface with practiced familiarity. "They will lock down the city's transit hubs. They will run facial recognition and genetic sniffers through every public system. They will quarantine sectors and sweep them block by block. It's a net. It's slow, but it's thorough." "So we don't use the public systems," Ilara countered. "We stay in the shadows, you know." "The shadows have their own gatekeepers," Kyle replied. "Informants, bounty hunters. Everyone in the underworld owes the syndicate a favor or a fear. A word in the right ear about a pale boy with a unique scent and an ex-syndicate cleaner. The price on our heads would be astronomical." He looked up from the datapad, his grey eyes locking onto Ilara's. "That is the problem. Your scent. It's a beacon. Even with suppressants, a sensitive enough sniffer can pick it up from 100 meters. It makes you impossible to hide." The truth of it settled heavily in the room. The very thing that made Ilara priceless was now his greatest liability. It was a signature he could not erase, a part of his very biology. He was a walking, breathing treasure map pointing directly to himself. He looked at his own hands, then back at Kale. The path forward was terrifyingly clear. The only way to corrupt the data was to destroy the source. "Then you have to leave me," Ilara said, the words tasting like ash. "They are hunting you because of me. Alone, you are a ghost. You can disappear. You know how. Kyle stopped typing. He slowly raised his head, and his expression was thunderous. The cold, analytical machine was gone, replaced by a raw, visceral anger. "No," he said, the word a flat, absolute negation. "That is not an option. It was never an option." "It is the only logical option," Elara argued, his voice rising with a desperate passion. "Your war is with the Syndicate, not with me. My existence endangers your mission. You saved me from the lab, Kyle. Let that be enough. Go. Burn them down. Don't let them catch you because you were tethered to me." "I am not tethered to you," Kyle snarled, slamming his hand down on the table. The flimsy wood cracked under the force of the blow. He stood up, his frame radiating a furious energy that filled the small room. "This was never just about you. It was about what you represent. Leaving you behind is the same as letting them win. It's admitting that some assets are disposable. It's accepting their calculus. I do not accept their calculus." He strode across the room and gripped Elara's shoulders, his fingers digging in with a painful intensity. He was no longer the gentle caretaker of the night before. He was the hunter, furious and absolute. "I did not spend 3 years carving a river of blood through their balance sheets just to abandon the source of the flood at the first sign of high water. We started this together. We will finish it." His face was inches from Elara's, his pale eyes burning with a conviction that was terrifying and exhilarating. The scent of ozone from him was sharp, electric, a storm about to break. Elara felt not fear, but a surge of something hot and defiant that met Kale's anger and held its ground. "Then what do we do?" Elara challenged, his voice low and intense. "How do we hide a beacon? How do we walk through a city of scanners when I am screaming my presence with every breath I take?" Kyle's gaze dropped to Elara's lips, then back to his eyes. The fury in his expression softened, replaced by a dawning, dangerous realization. A new tactical probability was presenting itself, one that was far more radical and far more intimate than any they had considered. "We don't hide the beacon," Kyle said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "We give it a new signal. We overwrite the signature." Elara didn't understand. How? Instead of answering, Kyle leaned in. The world narrowed to the space between them, to the scent of ozone and iron, to the heat of his body, to the glacial fire in his eyes. He lowered his head, and his lips met Elara's. The kiss was not gentle. It was not tender. It was an act of possession, a branding. It was harsh and desperate, the kiss of a man who had denied himself everything for years, finally claiming the one thing he had fought for. It was the taste of ozone, of iron, of rain, of 1,000 silent battles. But beneath the brutal force, there was a current of profound, aching need. Elara's mind went blank. Every sensation, every fear, every thought was annihilated by the overwhelming reality of Kale's mouth on his. And then, something deep inside him shifted. A biological lock, a fundamental part of his Omega nature that had been dormant and suppressed, suddenly recognized a signal it had been waiting for its entire existence. A claim, a bond. His body responded instantly. A cascade of hormones, a change in his own pheromonal output. His scent, the clear, bright fragrance of starlight and winter air, was suddenly infused with a new note, a darker, more complex chord. It was the scent of ozone and iron, the scent of Kale. He was being marked, his very essence rewritten by this desperate, violent act of union. When Kale finally pulled back, They were both breathing heavily, the air in the room thick with a new, combined fragrance that was both of them and neither of them. It was the scent of a bond forged in fire and blood. A bond, Kale breathed, his forehead resting against Ilara's. His control was shattered, his voice rough with shock at his own actions. It will mask your signature. Mingle it with mine. To their scanners, you will no longer read as a pure, unbonded Omega asset. You will read as mine. It was the most brutally pragmatic and devastatingly romantic act Ilara could have ever imagined. To save him, to hide him, Kale had bound him, claiming him in the most primal way possible. He had corrupted the data by tying it inextricably to his own. Ilara looked into Kale's stormy eyes and saw the terrible cost of that choice. The hunter, the solitary reaper, had just tethered himself to another soul. "You were not supposed to do that," Ilara whispered, his hand coming up to cup Kyle's jaw, his thumb stroking the rough stubble. Kyle closed his eyes, leaning into the touch. "The tactical probabilities," he murmured, his voice laced with a dark, bitter irony, "have been updated. They were no longer just allies. They were something more, something permanent. And as the syndicate's net closed in around the city, the two ghosts at its center had just become one."